Hello, this is Prabchintan Randhawa from Austin, Texas. It's 9:19 a.m. on Saturday, December 13th. I was listening to a podcast slash rambling slash lecture from Wolf Stream that. There's no other reason or rhyme. Just me hanging out on this Saturday morning listening to this. So hope you enjoy it. See ya.
Um, uh, let's see. There's a question here. If you could ban one buzzword from future science, what would it be? You know, a few years ago, probably 2017 or so, on April Fool's Day that year, I wrote a piece about, I called it Buzzword Convergence. It was about, I forget the order, quantum neural blockchain AI, or some permutation of those words. And actually, it was kind of, I thought, an interesting piece because I was kind of explaining some of the intellectual commonality between those different areas of the way that a lot of them have to do with sort of many inputs, one output, notion of attractors and things like this. But in any case, it tends to be the case that lots of science and technology and many things is driven by kind of the message that's delivered with a buzzword. In science, what's a buzzword that one doesn't like? I mean, I suppose the quantum buzzword gets added to many things, sometimes deservedly, sometimes not. I mean, and sometimes what people think of as, I think the one that I've been noticing recently is quantum biology, which was kind of at one time thinking about the effect of quantum mechanics in biology, but now seems to have generalized to be sort of future thinking about biological systems. Maybe I'm wrong that generalization has generally happened, but that's a case where it's very confusing because quantum has a definite meaning, and it's not that meaning. Now, the same thing has happened to some extent with AI. Some things where people say, I'm going to use AI to do this. They really mean I'm going to use computation in some way. Historically, sort of AI, when it originated in 1956, was something which it's like, we're going to get brain-like things to happen, but we imagine we're going to get brain-like things to happen through sort of a generalization of logic, through a generalization of something formalized. There was already thinking about neural networks, but it was more kind of we're going to do sort of symbolic reasoning, and that's going to be the way forward that allows us to use machines to do sort of superhuman intelligence-like tasks. What AI has come to mean in the last decade is neural net AI, or to many people, that's what it's come to mean, which is this kind of statistical approach. You train a system with lots of existing data and you say, go extrapolate to what you can get in the future. And I think that's, and now it's very confusing because people, does it mean we're going to use a neural network and try and train it on lots of existing science and have it figure out new science from that? Or does it instead mean we're going to use something computational to do science in a way that's sort of innovative in some fashion? I think it is coming to mean that second thing, which is more the kind of thing I've been doing for many decades now, unless they were just going to feed all of science into a neural net and have it take over from the scientists and go on from there. And it's often very confusing because people will say things like, we discovered this with AI. And what that often can actually mean is we did a computation where we enumerated lots of possibilities and we picked out good ones, maybe using some AI-like heuristic, or maybe just using good old-fashioned, did it fit this particular pattern computation? So that's a place where kind of it's becoming very confusing. What does one mean by AI? Does one mean this kind of train from examples, neural net type approach, or does one just mean sort of computation as a methodology in general? I suppose another thing that one might complain about in a buzzword for future of science would be the term science itself. I think the term science itself has become sort of a brand for this is knowledge you can't dispute. It comes from science. I do think that was an original idea of Francis Bacon back in the day of kind of if we tell them it's from science, they won't dispute it from the 1500s. But that's also a thing of today that, people feel like if I can say it's scientific, it comes from science, it's kind of then it must be right. Now, a confusing thing, if you think about the naming of fields, the fields like physics, biology, they don't have the word science tacked onto the name of that field. Fields like economic science or something, or maybe earth science, perhaps a more, I don't know, the areas that sort of were already a thing and then needed to feel like they were becoming more sciencey. And physics has sort of been the gold standard for science for a long time. And maybe deservedly, maybe not. In some ways, deservedly, because a lot of sort of big towers of consequences have been figured out in physics, and they actually work. But it's sort of a confusing thing that when people want to legitimize some area and say, yes, it's really a sciencey area, just add science to its name. And I think then the notion that, we proved it with science becomes kind of the you can't dispute it. Now, I mean, I have to say, I've been, particularly probably in the last decade or two, increasingly frustrated with things where people say, the expert scientists have said this or that. And the fact is, if you actually talk to the expert scientists and there's a lot of footnotes to that claim. And to say that's what the science says is really somewhat misleading. And so I suppose in terms of buzzwords for the future of science, the buzzword that I think perhaps is most challenged in some places is the word science itself. Sometimes it is used sort of as a way of papering over the lack of sort of foundational understanding of what's going on. And it's just like, well, it's what was done from science. Kind of an ironic twist on that question. Let's see. Oh boy, Itz is asking about it says there was an article about Google looking for UK experts to find uses for its new quantum chip. Do you think it's difficult to find interesting use cases for quantum computers? First, you have to make a quantum computer that actually means something. I've talked about this a bunch before. I mean, the big thing of quantum mechanics is that whereas in classical physics, sort of definite things happen, in quantum physics, many paths of possibility are followed. And then at the end, in sort of traditional quantum mechanics, we just get to say the probability of what happens. If you could make a quantum computer, the way you would make it is by using those many sort of threads of history in parallel to do many computations in parallel. But then at the end, the thing that is the most difficult is knitting those computations together to come out with a definite answer so that you as a human can say, yes, I got the answer. As opposed to there are all these things which are possible answers and possible computations going on the inside. Our brains expect definite answers. We can't make use of, oh, there are all these possibilities. That's not how we tend to set things up. So, the challenge for quantum computing, there's sort of maybe two types of computations that a traditional quantum computer seems to be potentially able to do well, factoring integers, doing various kinds of searches. But these are both things where those are both algorithms that were invented in the 1990s. And sort of the idea has been, is there going to be sort of a way to use the magic of quantum mechanics to use those algorithms to be able to do computations much faster? It's proved to be very difficult from an engineering point of view. And what's ended up happening, the practical side of it is people have been trying to figure out how to make computers out of things other than electrons and semiconductors. That's a perfectly valuable pursuit, figuring out how to make computers out of trapped ions or cold atoms or superconducting junctions or whatever else. It's not necessarily very practical for your average laptop, but it's certainly an interesting direction for the future for physics and for sort of thinking about future computers. The question, though, is if you actually want to do a practical computation, how does that really work? And the thing that tends to happen is, well, there's lots of noise, there's lots of sort of uncertainty in the results coming out from quantum computers, and there are various efforts to do error correction and so on, essentially sort of locking together different pieces of the output so that instead of sort of everything flopping around separately, you've made this rigid object that sort of all flops together, so to speak, as a way to sort of try and lock down to prevent kind of the noise that is sort of a symptom, I think, of the difficulty of kind of deducing sort of the one final result from all these possible intermediate results. So there are different sort of methods for making a quantum computer that kind of work by using different pieces of physics, by sort of leveraging different pieces of physics to do your computation. So one thing to do is to make things that are like logical gates of the kind used in a standard computer, ands and ors and things like that, or generalizations of those that work in quantum mechanics. Another approach is to say, I'm just going to set up this configuration of things. I'm going to try and find sort of the minimum energy configuration, the optimal configuration, kind of like you set up this landscape and you're asking where's the lowest point on the landscape. That's sort of a different type of quantum computing. And there are other things that sometimes get somewhat confusingly called quantum computing that are really quantum sensing technologies, where you're trying to find very accurately the magnetic field or something like this. Those are really a separate kind of thing, and I think they have much more immediate application. When it comes to the quantum computing side of things, there are these different modalities of, you're computing like logic with gates and so on, and you're computing, set up this configuration, find its minimum energy. Both are difficult to do in practice. The second one is probably a bit easier to realistically get something out of in practice. But yes, it's a figuring out, how can you make use of this kind of the technology that exists. And sometimes it's a good way of generating noise. And for some kinds of simulations, you want to generate lots of noise, lots of randomness, and so you can use it for that. I mean, a somewhat ironic thing is the use of quantum computers to simulate quantum systems. And it's like, well, what exactly does this mean? The quantum computer is a quantum system. What it means is you've got a particular quantum system you're interested in, like the molecule or something, and you want to use this general quantum computer. You want to set it up so that its behavior will correspond to the behavior of the molecule. For example, we'll simulate the molecule. And it's as if you've got, let's say some whole arrangement of levers and springs and things like this, and you want to simulate an object that has, a single lever and or two levers and two springs or something like this. And you say, well, I can hook up the levers and springs in this big thing that's an array of lots of levers and springs to make use of, to be just like the thing that is just two levers and two springs. And that's the same kind of thing that you're trying to do when you make a quantum computer simulate a quantum system. And that seems like a somewhat promising thing to do. I think this approach of we have a hammer of a certain kind, let's go look for nails that we can hammer with this kind of hammer. This is a thing that has been not so common in the history of technology, actually. Different companies have adopted sort of methodologies of things. It's somewhat affected by whether the company's main objective is to produce things that that make money by being sold to people, or whether the main objective is to do things which sound cool enough that their stock price will go up. That sounds very cynical, but that is a realistic distinction of different kinds of companies. And if the objective is of the second kind, to do things that seem cool so your stock price will go up, then having sort of things where you've got a hammer some misshapen hammer of some kind, and you just spent, $1 billion building that hammer, and now it's like we got to make this hammer, sing and dance for the public, and be something where people will be like, wow, they built that hammer. And so the best strategy is go try and find nails. And I think it's become slightly amusing in the AI business that lots of people, a big net has been spread of, contact all these scientists and mathematicians and so on, and ask them to sort of, for example, make up problems that can be solved by AIs. But really, a large part of that story is make up problems that can be solved by an AI. So you come up with a problem, and if the problem sounds interesting enough, then you can crow, look, my AI managed to solve this problem. I think it's not particularly useful if one's trying to understand what is the scope of the types of problems that AIs can solve, because you kind of went searching in this giant field for a nail that happens to be, bashable in by this particular hammer. Rohit asks, what do you make of the recurring motif among 20th century theoretical physicists leaning in the direction of Eastern philosophy? Well, I mean, again, in my cynical streak here, I could say that as the number of physicists increases, the probability that people will touch all different areas of culture also increases. But I don't think that's the main point. I think that there are kind of ideas about the nature of reality that have existed in Eastern philosophy for a long time that sort of speak to, and among other things, the relationship between the sort of inner observer and what is in the outside world, what is sort of going on outside. And that somehow has a resonance with quite a lot of what one's learnt in physics about sort of the separation of the observer and the observed, whether that's in relativity, of thinking about sort of how observers can think about simultaneity, whether that's in quantum mechanics, thinking about what observers can actually observe of the underlying quantum processes, or in more recent times in my own work, kind of how observers perceive things about Eastern philosophy than I would like. But I tend to think that there's great resonance between these kinds of ideas about the importance of the observer as a thing that is imposing kind of the way that the laws of physics are perceived, and the way the laws of physics that one perceives, the fact that the observer is a sort of participant in presenting, in leading to the laws of physics that we actually perceive. I kind of think that that's something which has some resonance with long discussed ideas in Eastern philosophy. And I think it's that type of thing, that the increasing recognition of the observer as an important part of the story of science is perhaps what's led to that interest. I mean, I think one of the things one sort of hopes about science, perhaps, or hoped about science in its early times, is that it's very objective. It doesn't matter what the observer is. Well, what's become clear from what I've done, for example, and from precursors in the development of relativity and quantum mechanics and so on, is, well, actually the observer matters. Not the observer in detail, not the every whim of the observer, but the general character of the observer. The fact that the observer is in a particular place in space-time, the fact that the observer has a certain size, the fact that the observer can't do certain levels of computation. The coarse facts about the observer turn out to matter a lot in deducing very precise science. And that's something which I think perhaps in Eastern philosophy, there's a little bit more detail of the observer that's thought about, but still the notion of the importance of the observer, I think, is one that's there. Let's see. Will asks, if you were building a new house for the future, what would you do or prepare for? It's an interesting question. What kind of cabling should you run in the walls? Should you run, Cat5 Ethernet cables? Should you run very in the walls, empty pipes, and you can and leave sort of of empty conduit. That's worked pretty well. Haven't had to open up any walls, at least not for that reason. It's been possible to just, when there's a new type of fiber optic cable or something like that, just pull it through the conduit, and that works. Now I have to say, when we built this house, for example, the computer that I used was a nasty, noisy computer, and so I had set it up so that I could have my office with my nice desk, and it will be very quiet. And the room next door had the computer that was making a loud noise, and there was some elaborate sort of run of conduit through the floor and so on to get cables, the sort of high-frequency cables that you need for displays, which have a big length limitation, to be able to just about get them, snake them through and through the floor and get them to the big noisy computer. Well, now the computer just sits behind my desk and it's absolutely silent. So that was something that became unnecessary to do there. I would say that this whole question about sort of the house of the future and the sort of increasing automation. When we were building this house 22 years ago or so, it was it was interesting at that time to see the different efforts that people have made to automate kinds of things, like, you wave your hand to make the lights go on, or you wave your hand to do this or that thing, and then you'd see videos of people who were doing these complicated, essentially dance moves in front of their televisions and things to get them to do different kinds of things. That UX has gotten progressively better over the years. I think the thing that is always surprising about sort of devices in houses is, in the end, there are wires and there's electrical supplies and things like this. And in the end, it's a sort of contractor style activity to go install this stuff. It's not, the only thing that isn't like that is anything that's wireless. And I suppose the number of things now that one can control from one's phone is much larger. I mean, it was the case that, there were lots of control panels that you would put in a house. And now those things are mostly apps that you go to on your phone. I will say that I think sort of the very fancy light switch thing, which has in general not been a big success. I think it's often just easier to, flip a light switch on or off. Maybe that's my own fault in the case of the particular house I'm in here, because very elaborate set of sort of complicated light switch configurations, which included the not so brilliant idea of mine that one would have double click mean something different from single click, because that allowed one to increase the number of possibilities on a keypad of a given size. I mean, I think that those are, so I mean, this question about how much sort of the automated house, what it looks like, and how much of that one can do is a question of what's important there, and how much elaborate controls should there be. Electronics show, and seeing every refrigerator had sort of a camera inside and sort of lots of smartness to it, and that doesn't seem to have become very popular. I think in there are other things that have kind of come and gone in home automation. I would say, well, in terms of the construction of houses, having robot vacuum cleaners, that's kind of a win, particularly if your house is set up so that the robot vacuum cleaner can have a happy time and doesn't just get stuck all the time. And I suppose if one was building a house, I don't know whether one should build one's house for the robot vacuum cleaner. It seems like one should build one's house for oneself, and one should assume that the robot vacuum cleaner will get progressively smarter. I mean, there's a big push, which we'll see how it comes out, towards humanoid robots as, and one of the use cases is kind of the home robot. Humanoid robots tend to be kind of a good form factor for robots, because the world that we live in as humans has been built so it works for humans. You have stairs that you can walk up with 2 legs and so on. You have doors you can open with a hand and things like this. And I think insofar as the world is built for the human form factor, having robots that have a human form factor, they're going to be sort of plug compatible and fit into that world. And then the question will be, if you have a home robot what should your house be like so that you best can service your home robot? My feeling is don't worry about it too much, because the home robots will necessarily develop to do things that are like what humans do, because that's what the market is, so to speak. And so most things that you would set up for humans will work for the humanoid robots. I mean, I think that's another kind of thing. I mean, I think that it's yeah, I'm noticing some comments here. From Tony about motion sensors for lights are not, quietly by yourself, and the lights just turn off, and then you have to wave your hands and the lights go on again, and it feels very kind of druidic. That it's a very sort of and maybe there's a way to be smarter than that. I mean, I know in my house we put motion sensors everywhere. It's kind of interesting to be able to see kind of the motion sensor profile of the house over the course of 20 something years, and you can kind of see different parts of the house got used more or less as children got older and disappeared and so on. It's different usage patterns and such like. I had at one time tried to figure out these algorithms for, can you figure out how people are going from one room of a house to another with motion sensors to solve the problem, among other things, of you're sitting quietly in the room and the lights go off. I never managed to figure out how to solve that problem. I'm sure you could solve kind of water pipes under your stone floor or something that deliver heat. Yes, it's kind of cool, a bad word to say given that you're talking about heating. Yes, our house has some of that. I think that's a fine thing. I will say about HVAC in general, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, that I've always been surprised at how comparatively little that domain has advanced. I mean, there's been a push to advance it because things like refrigerants have gone out of sequences, but there's been sort of a push for new refrigerants that's kind of forced a certain obsolescence of a certain amount of HVAC equipment. But in terms of how do you really control these things? Well, it's kind of a thermostat. And the thermostat can be a fancy thermostat that has a nice display, or it can be just a plain old thing with a lever that you move to change the thermostat. But how does the thermostat actually work? Well, it's a control system. And what does the control system do? Well, it's opening, it's switching. You basically get to switch on a heater, switch on a chiller, open a vent, close a vent. Those are the things that systems do. Now, you can imagine some very elaborate future system that has some kind of no moving parts, electrical way of guiding things and so on. But that's not how HVAC systems, even high-end ones, seem to work right now. They have a very coarse set of controls of it's either you're putting in heat, you're putting in cooling, you're whatever. And then the question is, well, how do you control such a thing? And the obvious that temperature, try and pull down the heat with cooling. Well, if you don't do that very carefully, you have a sort of disastrous situation because you're oscillating right above the set point, and you keep on switching things on, switching things off, and it kind of cycles all the time. In actuality, the most common thing is a so-called PID controller, which kind of integrates some of the smooth things out. Now, you can be more elaborate in doing those things. Actually, I was thinking a number of years ago of using Wolfram language because we have a bunch of control systems. Some simpler fixes were found that didn't involve doing that. But it's sort of interesting that the core technology for that, I don't think has really advanced much in a long time. I mean, there are things one can do that involve more kind of predicting what's going to happen and so on. And I suppose there are, okay, Tony is suggesting, I think, for lights, add a heat sensor. Okay, that's an interesting idea. That's not something one usually does. An infrared in the room. I guess the question then is, do the cats, if you have them or something, do they get the lights on or not? Are they enough of a source of heat and so on? And then the question is, if you're presumably the ultimate heating that's going into your room is not body temperature, because that wouldn't be very pleasant. So probably that wouldn't confuse things. I haven't heard of people doing that. It seems like a reasonable idea. Let's see. I'm trying to think about other things about houses, and another thing that's sort of a question about houses is displays. I'm not a television watcher, so I'm not really into having lots of sort of televisions to watch things everywhere. But I tell a story from a long time ago. Previous house we were renovating. Oh gosh, what was it? 30 years ago now. Where you could put a television, and the question was, is the television going to fit in a 4-inch deep niche? And I was like, yes, I've seen flat screen televisions, they're coming any day now. Well, actually, as my wife reminds me sometimes about predictions about the future, they didn't come for another 10 or more years after that time. It was sort of interesting because I'd seen flat screen televisions, they existed. The problem was that you couldn't manufacture them in bulk because there tended to be defects, manufacturing defects. And if you're making a memory chip and there's a defect in one part of the memory chip, you can always kind of route around that defect. But if you have a big screen, large flat screens, so kind of if you were prepared to get the 1 in 1,000 flat screen that came out perfectly, then you could get them a decade earlier. But if you want a display on the wall type thing, not wall, so to speak. They've been precursors of that technology for 30 years or more. Is that a desirable technology? I'm not sure. I don't know if that's, change your wallpaper every day type thing. I don't know if that's desirable. It has to be said, one thing that I thought about doing many years ago is setting up kind of a video conferencing wall. And I've seen some people have done this now, where you can have sort of half of a conference room in one place and half in another place. You can have kind of a conference room at your house or something where you sit down on one side of the table and there are other people on the other side of the table at a completely remote location. It is tricky to get the optics to work out right. It's like, how do you actually get a camera that will be able to, so an example of this in something like Star Trek, where they're always showing this sort of the crew of the Enterprise are talking to somebody else on this big screen. If you work out the angles, it couldn't work that way. There isn't a camera you could put that would make the thing sort of actually display it that way. And I think the same is it's a challenging thing if you want to make the half a conference room in one place, half a conference room in another place. But that's something maybe as you can kind of have a larger number of cameras and a larger display surface, that's something that probably becomes possible. Other things that people think about in houses, one question is, are the rooms square? Or I know many architectural experiments have been done with kind of more complicated shapes of rooms. My impression is they are not very successful. My impression is, it doesn't help whether it's kind of nature or nurture that causes people to like certain architectural forms and not like other architectural forms. Is it just that we're used to a particular thing, or is it that there's something in our nature that makes us kind of feel more comfortable with that? Or is it actually something intermediate that's kind of nurture from nature in a sense, where it's because of our experience of seeing things in the natural world that if we see something, if we see some kind of structure in a piece of architecture where we're like, that couldn't possibly stand up, and it makes us sort of feel a bit uncomfortable about it. Whereas if it looks like it's been set up in a way that nature might have set it up, where it will be very solid, that's a more desirable thing. I think the thing that there are these ideas like let's do a very different kind of thing for, let's say, the shapes of rooms. Same thing with chairs. There have been times when there's been a sort of a big enthusiasm for a different shape of chair, kneeling on them, doing this or that or the other. the truth is we humans are a certain shape. And, so it tends to be the case that things that we discovered a long time ago kind of more or less work. Sometimes technology intercedes, like your typical office chair of today is something much more comfortable to sit on for a long time than the thing that was there in the past. And that's one piece of kind of, I think the most significant thing probably coming to houses in the near future is probably humanoid robots, if that works out. It will certainly be, it will be curious if there are things that turn out to be unexpectedly difficult for humanoid robots to navigate. There'll be sort of a strange situation of, everybody, instead of when they have young children, putting up gates across the stairs, there'll be some other strange thing in houses that will be like, oh yes, I put this net here because otherwise my humanoid robot, falls downstairs or whatever else. I don't know how that will develop, but my guess is that the humanoid robots will end up being able to navigate the environment in sort of the same way that humans can. There's a comment here about humanoid robots. What was it? I think it was about providing power for humanoid robots. Let's see, couldn't find it, but I think somebody was asking about providing power for humanoid robots, and that has been traditionally an issue. I mean, it's always, you see these robots, and people say, this is an amazing humanoid robot. There are two things to look for of sort of the hacks of humanoid robots. One is the knees aren't straight, because when you do inverse kinematics, you do the kind of try and calculate the motion of robots, there's sort of a singularity when you lock your knees, or when the robot locks its knees. And so people often try to avoid that by having the knees slightly bent. That's one hack. The other hack is look in the back of the robot and look at how big the power cable is that comes out of the robot. That's and sometimes, you have this dancing humanoid robot, 200 degrees of freedom robot that doesn't have the great to have a humanoid robot in your house. Partly depends on how strong is the humanoid robot. I mean, in other words, if the humanoid robot could readily sort of come and crush you or something, that's one thing. If the humanoid robot is such that worst case you pick the thing up or you sort of push it away or something like that, it's a bit of a different thing. I mean, it feels like having a big tortoise in your house where, truth is you couldn't lift the tortoise if it's a giant, Galapagos tortoise or something. But still, I don't know how much you worry about that as a thing to have around. I mean, I think in terms of, there are all sorts of things that will surely come, whether to humanoid robots or to augmented reality, and things like one very obvious one of home relevance is visual diffs. You walk into Sony made this Aibo dog years ago, and the problem was just didn't seem nearly as attractive as the robot dog. Had been kind of dog-like, and some of these robots that carry packs for military applications and other kinds of things. The robot is going to be, does a dog notably doesn't have hands to pick things up, and a lot of barking at things and so on. Let's see. Oh yeah, here's a question from Took about solving the problem of power supply to humanoid robots. Let's see. Memes, comments. Painting an interactive thing on a wall makes me think of the Looney Tunes Wile E. Coyote painting a fake tunnel on a cliff face. The Roadrunner runs right through, and the Coyote smacks it through, and the Coyote smacks it into it face first. That confusing thing. I mean, that's something that's dealt with smartphones when you flip the display around. But one can imagine, gosh, what a all sorts of strange issues with having, and again, as you say, as it becomes more realistic, there's more tendency to walk into the wall type thing. No doubt. I don't know what. There are usually cues on, big mirrors and things like this. There are cues from sort of the framing around it and so on. This is a mirror, rather than, just walk straight through it. Hills asks, would your ideal at-home robot have wheels or legs? It's got to have legs. There's no, there are enough things built in the world of houses that assume you have legs, whether it's stairs, whether it's thresholds for things, whether it's even getting on a ladder, it's got to emulate what we have, I think, to be sort of plug compatible with the environment that we've set up for ourselves. Let's see. I have to close soon here, but let's see if there are more good. Talking about future houses is kind of interesting. I think one of the challenges always with putting technology into a house is because it's often contractor type, construction type stuff. Upgrade the thing, and certainly if you have to sort of open up the walls and things like this, you've got a whole giant adventure going to be able to make any upgrades. I have to say that I think the biggest thing with houses probably coming when there is sort of real breakthroughs in robotics is the cost of construction, and the fact that some of the cost of construction is materials, but a lot of the cost of construction is labor, and it's and as time's gone on, houses just have more and more elaborate stuff in them that's more and more elaborate to build in, and one has to believe that if one could have kind of lots of robotic work done on that, and you have a giant swarm of robots that descends to construct a house, and they're working on it 24/7 and so on, and then that, first of all, one can do more elaborate things in the construction of houses. One can, and second of all, there are really bizarre things one can imagine like possible given the current cost of things. Perhaps people should try making an insect or a small fish robot first, just like nature made them first, and only move on to more advanced creatures later. I think that was the order in which biological evolution could construct things. I kind of think once you know the answer, if you want a biped with hands and fingers, robots and insect robots, I think insect robots, just like in the science fiction movies, are often for various kinds of surveillance purposes. You can have the little tiny thing go and surveil some place, maybe even without getting noticed. The fish robots are, well, it's a question of what are they going to be useful to us? Again, it's sort of a surveillance or delivering something purpose, or going and home humanoid robot does what it can do things which are immediately compatible with the things we humans want to do. A fish robot, well, it can be in your swimming pool. It's a very common thing these days to have robots that are kind of like the analog of vacuum cleaners for the surface of a swimming pool. But I don't quite know what the fish robots what we'd use them for. I suppose. I'm actually having a hard time thinking of what a fish robot would be, what the use case for us humans would be for a fish robot. If if in some future time, the civilization of the whales or something develops, then no doubt they'll be much more into having fish robots. Maybe I'm missing something there, but I'm not seeing a. Twitch is commenting deep sea exploration for sure. That's although it'd say, well, we could have jungle exploration being done all the time by drones. We don't. We have one survey every whatever. And Hill's comments, underwater tunnel digging maybe. I kind of think that ends up being a giant industrial machine that gets lowered and then drills the tunnel. I don't think the idea of the robotic fish that is kind of chewing its way through through things doesn't seem all that realistic to me. And I suspect a lot of time one's dealing with bedrock and you're dealing with explosions and things, and then maybe the robotic fish gets to place the explosive material, but I don't think otherwise. It doesn't seem obvious to me that it has a particular use case. I mean, I suppose you can imagine a situation for exploration where, if you could have an autonomous robot that would fit through the cracks, I don't really know. I don't think there are so many cracks. I think that particularly, I mean, I have to say, in terms of robots of exotic locations, the robotic earthworm has always seemed like an interesting one to me, being able to kind of through soil and so on. Why is that relevant? It's relevant in cities where people started laying down all kinds of cables and wires and so on, 130 or 150 years ago now, and nobody knows where those things are. And when you say, I'm gonna dig in the city, it's like, whoops, well, you might destroy this electrical cable that was put there, in 1892 or something. And so that there's a reason to want to explore that way. The other thing is for archaeology, it will be wonderful. There are many modern cities that are built on sites that have been in use for 4,000 years, let's say. And I don't know, thinking of, Athens or something like that, from, the 6th century BC or something like this, and be able to go and find the artifacts from that. And that would be sort of an application of the I don't know what one would call it, the terabot or something that kind of goes through the ground. All right, well, with that, thanks for all sorts of interesting questions and prompts there. I should run off my day job, but thanks for joining me, and look forward to chatting with you another time. Bye for now.